Welcome, everyone. This is Joe Armstrong and the Power Systems Virtual User Group. And I want to welcome you to our August session, our August webinar. Hope everyone's having a good summer and staying healthy. So let's see, I only have really one announcement before we get started, and that is just to talk about TechU. And if you've listened to these webinars much in the past, you've heard me talk about TechU before. I think it's the best conference that IBM puts on. And again, unfortunately, with COVID, it's virtual again this year. And just really miss being there in person and seeing people, but you know, it is what it is. So it's in October. There's a link on the Power Systems Virtual User Group wiki site that you can go, and registration is open. Because it's virtual, it's pretty darn cheap now, so cost really shouldn't be a barrier to going or attending the sessions. And with the sessions and registering, of course, you get access to all the recordings and all the replays and everything from that. So, you know, certainly invite everybody to join that, and I think it would be a great thing. Second, the presentation materials for today are also on the wiki, so you can download those if you need to. I am recording the session, so the recording has been started. There's two panels on the WebEx. One is a chat, so chat all you want. There's also a Q&A panel. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A panel. That's the one that really will be monitoring for questions. So if you have a question, put them in the Q&A panel. So let's get started for today. As you can see on the screen, today we're going to talk about open source technology. It's kind of been, becoming more and more prevalent, and actually, everybody thinks of open source really with, I think, associated with Linux, and of course it is. But a lot of the open source stuff is also available on AIX and IBM I. So let's talk about that. We have Jesse Grzinski here to present for us. Jesse is a tinkerer, a programmer, a hacker. Boy, that's interesting. I guess if you're a hacker, if you're a programmer, you can be a hacker, and a tinkerer is if you're a programmer for sure. And he's also an award-winning speaker. So Jesse is a business architect at IBM and has helped build open source ecosystems on the IBM I platform. But what he's going to talk about will equally, be relevant for AIX as well. So Jesse has helped countless numbers of small businesses and enterprises deploy open source to solve their real-world needs and develop, best in industry solutions. In his spare time, Jesse likes playing with his dog and then also replacing complex applications with a couple dozen lines of Python or Java. So apparently a big advocate for that. So Jesse's got a bachelor's degree in computer science and a master's in business administration, so he understands both the technical and the business aspects of all this stuff. So like I said, Jesse's presentation is on the wiki, so you can download that. And with that, Jesse, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Joe, and thank you for that fantastic introduction. So I will save the time of introducing myself, although I do want to say that I am hoping to change my official title here at IBM to Open Source Madman, as indicated by the PowerPoint slide. So I figure if I put it on the title of enough PowerPoint slides, then it is indeed real. But thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to Joe and all of his colleagues for help setting this up and facilitating me being here today. And like Joe said, feel free to ask any questions you want in the Q&A chat over on the right-hand side, most likely, of your WebEx interface. For the next 75 minutes or so, I actually have a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today, primarily focusing on open source and open source on IBM I and AIX, right? And so we're going to talk a bit about, some of the business value, why is it important, hopefully address one of the top fears that people sometimes have about open source. So we're going to dig into that. We'll talk a little bit about what open source is available to you, how you tie perhaps existing legacy applications in with open source. Then we'll talk about, where do you go to get support for this stuff, right? What opportunities, what options are available for that? And time permitting, I'll go into a couple success stories as well. But like I said, we do have a lot that I'm going to cover today, so we'll be moving quickly. But again, feel free to ask any questions along the way. Right. So one of the primary questions that people sometimes ask, especially when they are in the strategizing phase, right? When they're thinking about new projects, thinking about ways to meet new business needs, and they look at all the various options, and they usually have some open source option on the table. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about today is why is that open source option really important? What business value does open source bring to the table for an IBM Power shop, right? Whether you're AIX or IBM I or Power Linux, why do you want to embrace this stuff? Right. And I do want to start out, one of the main reasons is really this notion that open source can fundamentally change the capabilities of the system that you have. Right? You already have an IBM Power system. And with the investment in open source that IBM has made in IBM I and AIX over the past 5 years, I would say even the past 2 years with IBM I, what the system can do now is so vastly different from what it was able to do a few years ago, right? The capabilities that we have and the stuff that I have seen people do with open source on IBM Power systems is just amazing stuff, right? And that's actually one of the favorite things about my job here at IBM is I talk to a lot of customers who are doing some of this really cutting edge stuff, right? Where we have customers doing AI, we have customers integrating with quantum computing actually, and leveraging the IBM Quantum, IBM Q, System 1 systems, and so on. We have more and more customers building CI/CD pipelines so that it's the whole developer ergonomics and admin ergonomics, from writing code to having it deployed in production with high quality assurance, is smooth and painless, right? One of our favorite success stories from a few years ago is a furniture manufacturer who's doing 3D visual rendering, all on IBM I, where they brought in these open source graphical libraries, right? IoT is, of course, a big initiative these days, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on a couple times in this presentation as well. But the bottom line is that, you know, the world is heading in all of these different directions. There's all of these new technology sets, and simply put, open source is the conduit, the gateway that gets you to leveraging all of this new technology that's being invented on a near daily basis, right? And so I often talk about taking the hybrid approach to application development or to designing your solution, right? And when I talk about the hybrid approach, I really just mean leveraging the best of both worlds, right? So we all love, perhaps, hopefully the majority of us love IBM Power and Power Systems, and AIX and IBM I both have these really valuable attributes, right? With the low TCO, we all know they're secure and reliable, and some of us have applications that are 10, 20, 30 years old that you're still able to run, still able to leverage, and the maturity of the code actually works as an advantage, right? And so the idea of taking a hybrid approach, what we sometimes call the blended approach, is that you continue to leverage the best that your platform has to offer, right? You continue to leverage the best of DB2, the best of the programming languages. Like the IBM I folks have RPG, which is a really unique value because it's a programming language highly embedded in the database and the operating system. So you continue to leverage that, but you augment with open source technologies. And you augment with open source technologies, which means you can then also leverage all the stuff I just talked about a minute ago, right? You need to interact with quantum computing because quantum computers can deal with Boolean satisfiability problems, orders of magnitudes quicker, or you need to do machine learning and AI, whatever it is, you can now augment with open source and accomplish some really fantastic stuff and build. This is the approach that we see when we see people building best in industry solutions, is they're almost always taking this hybrid approach. And we have a lot of success stories and case studies that illustrate this fact, right? And you can, in the handouts, you can take the links and read up more on these. But a very common theme, if you look at IBMI businesses who are, doing the best of breed stuff, who are beating out their competitors, who are reducing their costs, they're taking this blended approach where they're taking their investment in power and adding value to that investment by leveraging open source, right? And you can dig into these and you can see people, enjoying the multitude of languages they have, enjoying this idea that they can continue to leverage these 20, 30-year-old applications, but still be doing cutting edge stuff with it. Again, that alone, just the capabilities alone, is a lot of business value. So if you forgot everything else that I'm going to talk about today, and you wanted to distill the business value of open source, the big thing is really the capabilities, right? And there's a lot of other valuable aspects, which I'll talk about, but the capabilities is the large central piece. There's so much that you can do with open source because you have, in a sense, millions of developers on your team when you're leveraging open source, right? So in particular, we've been doing a lot in the IBMI space with customer stories lately. We're publishing new ones all the time. We just published a new customer story of somebody using PHP with IBM Power Systems earlier this week. But you can go read some of these stories at ibm.biz/IBMI stories, this short link here for you. And you can see, again, what people are doing with IBM Power, and in a lot of cases with leveraging open source on or with IBM Power. But I did want to allocate some time today, and I'll probably spend a decent amount of time talking about this because I find that this notion of security is sometimes a dissuading factor when it comes to open source. Right? There is a myth sometimes among IT leaders or developers or architects. There's this myth sometimes floating around that open source software is not very secure, or is not as secure as perhaps your own homegrown applications or proprietary applications. And so I'm going to spend some time today addressing some of the reasons why that's not the case. Right. And I'm not going to actually take this survey, but just ask this of yourself as an attendee today. What is your perception? Do you think that open source is just as secure as anything else? Do you think it's less secure? Do you think it's more secure? Right, just ask that of yourself, and also think, what would your colleagues think if you were to ask them this question, right? But like I mentioned, open source itself is very secure. It's trusted by the vast majority of Fortune 500 companies. In fact, some people predict all of the Fortune 500 companies are using open source for core business. It's used by the United States Department of Defense. It's used by NASA. It's used all over the place when people need a high level of security. But let's talk about why, right? One of the reasons why is demonstrated in bug bounty programs. And bug bounty programs are, you've probably heard of them, but they are just these foundations or funds that reward friendly hackers for finding security vulnerabilities in open source software, so that it's less likely that some business running in production actually has some security issue in deployment, right? So one of the more popular bug bounty programs, and it's one of many, is called the International Bug Bounty, or IBB. And it really is just a pile of cash, and there's a governing board that determines how to divvy out payments and things like that. But it essentially just gives you money if you find a security flaw in one of the major open source packages. And some of the projects that participate in the IBB are, as you can see here, some really core technologies that are powering modernization efforts, including on IBM Power, major technologies that are powering the web. You have technologies like OpenSSL, which is powering encryption used by the vast majority of financial institutions. And so you have some really key projects that take part in this, and you have some really key companies who are also backing this up. So, uh, these are companies that you probably recognize, especially Facebook, GitHub, Microsoft, right? Big multi-billion-dollar companies are donating to this international bug bounty, right? And that's actually a uh, key attribute of open source that people sometimes overlook as well. In that when you adopt open source, you are actually aligning yourself strategically with the moves that other large companies, other companies who you think of as forward-looking, innovative companies, you're actually aligning yourself with them, right? Facebook, GitHub, Microsoft, and there's others I'll talk about in a couple slides, all in on open source. So from a strategic perspective, it just seems like this is the winning team, right? So you have these companies donating the money, and they've paid out almost $1 million in bug bounties now. And again, this is one of many bug bounty programs. Node.js, for instance, has its own bug bounty programs through the OpenJS Foundation. But they've had a couple hundred, we call them friendly hackers, and they found some of the most pervasive bugs or security vulnerabilities in this open source software. It A lot of people believe before they were really a problem, right? So several years ago, you might remember Heartbleed, and it really made a lot of headlines all over the place. And it seemed like a really scary thing where you have this pervasive open source library, and there's this vulnerability, and you're getting emails from your banks and retailers saying, oh yeah, you weren't affected, or we may have had a vulnerability. But there's not really been any confirmed cases of somebody exploiting Heartbleed, because it was found very quickly through the bug bounty program by the security professionals that are combing through the code even right now as I speak to you, right? So right now there are hundreds or thousands of people scanning these open source projects, making sure that they are indeed secure. Now, a similar project is known as the Core Infrastructure Initiative. Again, this is a much larger project. Actually, it's kind of complementary to the bug bounty programs in the sense that they are really um, managing the open source projects more holistically and making sure that these open source projects have security professionals allocated to look at the code, that they have the proper resources to run regression testing and penetration testing and all of that. And it's managed by the Linux Foundation, which of course, has a lot of backing behind it as well. So if you were to look at, and this is just a subset of the list, if you were to look at the companies who sponsor the Core Infrastructure Initiative, again, these are companies you recognize. IBM is very proudly on the list, right? You have Amazon, you have Bloomberg, you have Salesforce, VMware. These are all companies who have skin in the game with open source and have identified open source as a large element of the strategic future. So again, when you adopt open source, you are aligning yourself with a lot of other companies who view that as the future, right? As the direction. Right? So let's back up for a minute and just think almost philosophically, right? Why would open source be less or more secure than proprietary software? And usually when people think that there's security issues with open source, they usually cite that first reason right there. It's like, oh, the malicious people, that bad actors, the people who are trying to hack into my bank, they can easily see the source code, right? Um, but hey, guess what? First off, people who are skilled hackers don't need to see the source code for things, right? They can still reverse engineer the code. You have anything that talks to the network, for example, you can easily see, what's the network protocol, and you can start tracing things back from there. You can start looking at the machine instructions and where you do reads, and you can find unchecked buffers and things like that really easily if you're a skilled hacker, right? You look at open source, we have these large initiatives funding these key projects, right? So we have millions of dollars going into projects like OpenSSL and OpenSSH and Node.js every year, right? And so we have a lot of funding for these, again, these key open source projects. Where proprietary, you just have to fund, you just have to trust the owner, right? Whether that's you, right? If you plan on rolling your own, completely proprietary solution, are you going to be investing millions of dollars every year in that to keep up with open source? Maybe, maybe not, right? But again, I won't walk through all of these, but open source projects, some of them have tens of thousands of contributors, right? Node.js, I think, has something around the lines of 30,000 contributors to the code, but it's all governed in a pretty sane way, right? And there's a lot of people therefore that can find the bugs and fix the bugs, right? But another key point as well is that if we were to look at things like encryption protocols, security protocols, open source is generally the very first technology to adopt those things, right? And this is OpenSSL has supported TLS 1.3. This is an old slide, but it's, it supported the new TLS protocol basically as it was finalized, right? And in some cases, they actually used the open source code as part of the discussion to say this is what the protocol should look like, right? Because they're able to just work on the code as the protocols are shaped, as the new Cypher suites are shaped. Whereas proprietary code will always have some kind of lag behind. So, there are certain elements where you can't, you could easily argue that a full proprietary stack cannot be as secure as open source for this reason alone, right? Because proprietary code always lags behind when it comes to new encryption technologies, right? So that's the philosophicals, but we went to the marketplace, and some of you know that IBM partners with help systems, and we do market research with help systems to try to get good insights on this. And so we asked IBM Power customers, in this case, IBMI customers, we asked, what are your greatest IBMI cybersecurity challenges? And by the way, this parallels, this is not unique to IBMI, this parallels a lot of market research that's targeted to the whole IT industry. It parallels concerns among people who are responding for Linux and Red Hat, and these are just very common concerns, right? So if we were to look at the top cybersecurity challenges as identified by the client base for IBM Power, and again, the industry as a whole, people are saying, well, they lack the security knowledge and the skills. They say the threats are changing constantly. They say it's hard to do the balance, right? Because the more secure you are, the less efficient you are, right? Or at least that's a common perception, right? You have all this advancements in cloud. Companies are embracing hybrid cloud or hybrid multi-cloud. And how do you secure all of that, right? You're doing IoT, so you have all these edge devices that are connecting into your core systems. How do you deal with all of that, right? And quite often, of course, IT departments don't have a whole separate bag of money to fund security, right? They just say, here's your budget, here's the new requirements, here's the new business needs that we have. They don't also allocate a bunch of money for security, right? So that's what the client base has been telling us and others about the challenges to security. And so if we take the lens of saying, well, how can open source help with these? You actually realize that open source really can address these concerns very directly, right? You have a concern that your staff doesn't have the in-depth knowledge, right? Well, guess what? Open source technologies have a lot of, I say Googleable solutions, right? And it's not passing the buck. It's like you can find forums, you can find documentation, you can find, sometimes documentation right in the code repository uh, to help you figure out the proper way to deploy a security model, and more importantly, to do it with some confidence, because you're able to find a lot of other people and a lot of other use cases doing the same thing that you are, right? Typically, your security challenges are not unique as much as you may think so, right? And again, like I mentioned, you're concerned about security threats changing constantly, but don't worry, because open source is the bleeding edge when it comes to security. When there's a new type of security vulnerability, open source generally has that fixed immediately, right? And it's all governed and it's all in the open. Whereas if you were to compare that to proprietary solutions, you just have to blindly trust the manufacturer, the provider, right? And so again, sometimes those lag behind, right? Um, talk about the balance. You have cost effectiveness of open source. You have the fact that open source is becoming very industry standard. You talk about IoT and cloud and AI, and yes, all of these areas has open source that's there and to help you secure your solution, because that's just where open source is evolving, right? And again, you have a lack of budget. Well, so you supplement your budget by leveraging open source, and you're in a sense leveraging the money that Facebook and Google and IBM and Samsung and all the others are putting into efforts like the Core Infrastructure Initiative, into the OpenJS Foundation, into the Internet Bug Bounty. You leverage all of that expenditure as well in your solution. So again, strategically, you're taking advantage of what these Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies are doing. So a real benefit to open source is that it is secure, and you can actually bolt on open source to existing applications to add a level of security. But let's move on to another great benefit of open source, which is perhaps a little bit more obvious and straightforward when people think about what might open source do for me, and that is modernizing your applications, right? And in a sense, some of you may know, I really dislike the M word, modernization. And the reason I dislike the M word is because you can ask 30 different people what modernization means to them and for their business, and very well, you might get 30 very different answers, right? There are some common themes, and I'll try to address some of them, but modernization means a lot of things. People are now talking, digital transformation as a different term, which I think is maybe a little bit more fitting. But if you're using open source with IBM Power, whether it's AIX or IBM I or Linux, IBM has invested a lot in these integration points, right? So what I mean by that is just like the graphic is trying to demonstrate here, whatever your needs are, if you need to connect to the system from from an IBM Power partition, from an IoT device, whatever, and you have an application stack that's using some language, and you need to talk to the database, you need to call your AIX programs, you need to call your IBM I programs, there's integration points to help you do all of these things. So there's a lot of, again, a lot of capabilities available to you to do that augmentation that I talked about earlier, where you add value to your existing investment by adding in open source because we have all of these connectors. And I see we do have a question in the Q&A as well, so thank you for bringing questions. We have a question that says, open source requires constant patching compared to closed source software, which increases operational complexity. And yes, that is indeed something I'm going to talk about later on. But my perspective is that, first off, yes, you definitely need to address the need for more frequent updates with open source. It is one of the hidden costs, if you will, of open source. And, in short, the cost benefits of open source tend to outweigh the cost disadvantages of open source, that being one of them, right? So I'll come back and I'll talk about some of that a little later on in this presentation as well. But you are correct that it does increase, as you put it, operational complexity, because you do have to adapt to a new update schedule, right? Because like I said, you might have a new security vulnerability, and the good thing is that these open source projects are, again, I'm speaking in generalizations, addressing them immediately, but that means that you as a company also has to have some kind of mitigation strategy and update strategy in place, right? It's a very common mistake people have made with IBM Power, especially IBM I. We talk to clients all the time who haven't updated their their PHP runtime in 10 years. And that's not the way to do it, right? So circling back to that M word, modernization, like I said, it could mean 30 different things to 30 different people. But like I said, there are some underlying themes, right? A lot of times when people are talking about some kind of modernization effort, they are talking about some kind of web page that they'd like to build, some kind of web interface, some kind of mobile app, or some kind of API, right? They want to deliver things through REST interfaces or GraphQL interfaces, right? And in short, if you're doing web technologies, you're using open source, right? Unless you're in a very, very small minority. In general, all of these web technologies are powered by open source, right? I was at a small user group meeting once, and somebody told me, yeah, my company has a corporate-wide policy against using open source. And, I'm kind of blunt sometimes. I said, that sounds like a lie. Right? In more polite terms. But I said, I'm skeptical, right? And I said, what's your company? And the gentleman told me the name of his company. And so I pulled up the company website and I started probing the technologies behind their website. And I showed them, yep, they're using an open source HTTP server. Yep, they're using open source to generate their TLS certificates. So just from the initial touch from a user perspective, I'm touching open source. Your company is using open source, right? So if you're doing any of this modernization stuff in general, think about the stuff I mentioned earlier, AI, cognitive, you're using open source. And the other great thing as well is that there are a lot of industry standard technologies that our IBM Power clients have been able to deploy, in an hour, right? Just because we've invested in the portability of these open source projects, or the open source projects are written in these high level languages that we provide. And so we have some of these solutions that are very common, especially the PHP ecosystem, where companies can very quickly, very easily deploy things like Joomla or WordPress or Drupal inside their shop. And again, it's not a huge outlay of investment upfront, right? So moving on, what else is open source good for? Again, I have time. I'm talking about what I can. Uh, Open source is really good for finding developer skills, right? And that's true for the acquisition case, right? Um, Especially in IBMI, we sometimes have people come to us and say, yeah, we can't find IBMI developers, right? True for AIX sometimes as well, where it's like, well, this even AIX, it's a foreign platform to some people. So when I go out and I post on Indeed looking for an experienced AIX developer, I don't get a lot of bites. Same thing. Same thing is true of IBMI, right? We just have that conversation, and they say, yep, it's hard to find developers, right? The other thing is they say, well, we want to move our existing staff. We don't have a hiring budget, but we want to move our existing development staff to building more IBM Power solutions because IBM Power is such a great hardware platform, right? Well, guess what? Open source actually helps with both of those use cases, right? So if we were to look at hiring, for instance, I'm going to show you a few actual real job postings. And again, these are IBMI examples, but the same is true. The concepts are the same, hold true for AIX as well. Here's one that says, hey, looking for AS400 RPG developers, 100% remote, which is good, progressive. This was a screenshot I took a couple years ago before pandemic, so they were on top of things then. But it's like, yep, message me for more info. But all they really say is a platform and a programming language, which is perhaps not the most popular in the industry. We have another one here that says, hey, are you an AS400 RPG expert? And we're looking for you. And they talk about, they're a leader in their industry, even though AS400s have not been made in like 13 years. And so the problem is that some of these job postings don't get a lot of bites. And I see a couple questions in the Q&A. I'll circle to those in just a minute. Whereas if you embrace it, kind of a very open source augmenting approach to building your new solutions, to architecting your solutions, this is a real job posting as well. And look at this one. It says actively looking for Angular developer for one of our valuable clients. This is also a recruiting agency, but they say, hey, you should have experience with Angular and Node.js and Java and this web stuff. Right? And they even put together some fancy graphics, which surprisingly helps as well, right? Now, the interesting thing about this job ad is what? They don't mention the operating system. Are you applying for a job where you're on Linux, Windows, IBM AIX? You don't know, but guess what? A lot of the applicants don't care, and you're going to get hundreds of people perhaps interested in this job, and you can be selective about finding the best skills to accomplish your objectives, right? So these types of job ads are very effective, because even if you took this exact same job ad and said, for instance, I'm actively looking for an Angular developer for AIX, guess what? You're going to intimidate anybody who doesn't have AIX skills. They might be the best programmer in the hemisphere writing Node.js code and doing all of this web stuff, but they're going to be like, I don't feel qualified, and they're not going to apply. But in reality, it really doesn't matter. The idea here is that you can hire open source skills, and then whatever other skills are needed for your core business, they can develop those over time. So I always say, day one, they can be adding value to your company. 2 months in, they can also be maintaining and expanding and building applications in core business, right? Because they can learn the technology, right? And that's demonstrated by some of the things that we've done with our marketing teams. And IBM Systems Magazine used to have this campaign called Fresh Faces, where they highlighted all of these people who were early tenure people who joined IBM Power without much of a background on IBM Power. They just knew open source, as a lot of younger skills know, right? They knew open source. They're able to, get hired into a company, and they learned IBM Power, and they learned to love IBM Power. And a lot of success stories we see like this, not just the ones that we publish, right? The reason for all of this is because as we've adopted open source for AIX and IBM I, we've adopted all of these things to make the application development experience normal, right? It's not like it's some weird thing. You don't need access to a 5250 session or anything weird like that. You can hire people in, and they can be using the tools that they've been using for, their previous professional endeavors, or for their college projects if they're a new college hire. They can just sit down, and it's familiar because we're leveraging all of these industry standard technologies, and there's a lot of value in that as well. Because again, you can have people hitting the ground running. And even our IBM teams, the open source teams, as we've hired and staffed up, we've been able to hire on our teams people who were fresh out of college, who've never touched an IBM Power system before in their life, and then they're able to sit down and use their familiar tools and do familiar things and add value, right? So I'm going to pause back over to the Q&As. I see we have a couple here again, taking a few minutes to get to those, so I apologize. So Bonnie asks, how often do you recommend updating the open source software? Their current policy is monthly. And I actually say, as with a lot of things, it depends, but a good general practice is once every month or once every 2 months, right? So your company doing it monthly is fantastic, right? We even have, not just IBM I and AIX, even companies running Linux, some of them even have 3 to 6 month policies, which is still usually okay, right? If you have anything that's external facing, like if you're a bank, you want to do it more frequently for your public-facing website, for instance. But generally, once every month or once every 2 months is a really good cadence, in my opinion. So, see some other comments about Q&A not visible,
yeah,
and
you can
that's
skip the next
yep.
couple and go to the last one there, Jesse.
Yep. Yeah, because when you ask a question in the Q&A, I believe just the panelists see it. So then, the other people
Until
who
it's
are attending
answered.
don't
Yeah.
necessarily,
So you
until
type
it's
in an
answered.
answer.
Exactly. And so John Engel is asking the $1 million question. With so many open source offerings, how do you choose which ones to select for your modernization effort? And that's something I don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of detail for that today, but generally, a good idea is, first off, just look at what things will provide you a solution with the best time to market, right? So there's a few technologies where you might say, hey, I can spend an afternoon deploying thing X and it's there, right? WordPress is a great example of something that has solved those types of needs a lot, because people said, hey, we can install WordPress, and WordPress has its own plugin architecture, and we install plugin X, Y, and Z, and 2 hours later, they're done, right? And sometimes the answer is obvious. Sometimes it's not so obvious. But generally, it's, first off, try different technologies, right? You might try a Python package versus an integration framework like Camel, which I'll talk about later. Don't be afraid to try multiple approaches. In a couple days, you can get a lot done with open source, right? So don't be afraid to try different approaches. And sometimes you also get a feel for what one just fits best with your needs, right? And the other piece of advice I have is also to look at where are these other forward-looking companies, these companies who are embracing open source, what technologies are they using that we know about, right? If you look at web front-end frameworks, for instance, right, you have React is very popular, and the driving force behind React is Facebook. Facebook basically built React, and you can leverage that for your own personal development and your own business needs. So if you're comparing, gee, should we adopt React or should we adopt, a much smaller project that was somebody's spare time endeavor? It's like, well, you align yourself with React because, again, it's that strategic alignment with those larger companies. And I apologize, the answer to your question isn't simple. And that's one of the harder things that people run into is how do you actually choose which open source to use? Because there's so much out there. Right. So thank you for that question. And by the way, I'll mention this later on as well. You always have a community that you can go to and you can ask opinions as well. And so I'll send some links and some pointers later on in the presentation today, where you can go ask colleagues who are running AIX or IBMI and say, hey, here's my requirements. Does anybody have experience doing this? And you might just find somebody else says, oh yeah, I just deployed ActiveMQ and Nginx, and I put these puzzle pieces together and I had success. Right? So I have a blog entry. It was actually a guest written blog entry a few years ago that talks a little bit about this hiring thing that I mentioned. And the short story here is that they needed a new developer for their IBMI system, and they were essentially able to just go hire somebody out of college who knew PHP, and they did exactly what I was talking about, where they had him bringing value on day one, and then a few months in, he was learning the core business and doing a lot of other stuff as well. So another unique value of open source is related to doing analytics and business intelligence, which among AIX and IBMI customers is a priority topic these days. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. I could come back for another whole 90 minutes sometimes if you wanted, but generally speaking, if you're doing AI, if you're doing a lot of analytics stuff these days, the innovations that are happening are primarily happening in open source communities, right? Even things like IBM Quantum, the quantum toolkits and things like that, they're all these open source projects with developers all around the world working on it. and they can just build stuff and innovate a lot faster in this open source way of doing things, right? And so open source communities is where the BI and analytics realm is growing the fastest, and will, in my prediction, this will eclipse anything that's not open source in a matter of just a couple years, right? And there's a lot of this stuff that can run on IBM Power, right? Whether you AIX, IBM I, Linux, there's a lot of stuff that just runs on IBM Power, easily installable. So you can do machine learning, you can do deep learning, you can do data analytics, you can even leverage the Power architecture to do some of these really, really quickly, whether you're running AIX or IBM I. So there is that element as well, right? But also when people start doing BI work, business intelligence work, or they start deploying AI in their organization, they need to access other bits of data as well, right? It's not necessarily a setup where you have all of your data that you need to start doing AI in a single database, right? It's not all just in a DB2 database somewhere. You probably also have some information that's perhaps unstructured data. You might have stored video feeds, audio feeds. You might have a MongoDB database that you need to talk to. You might have other forms of relational databases that you need to talk to. And again, the conduit for doing all of those things, generally speaking, is open source, because you can talk to all of those things. Social media, right? More and more solutions are looking to analyze Twitter feeds and things like that. And again, how do you connect to social media? It's with open source, right? How do you connect to things like IBM Watson? It's with open source, right? Because with open source, we have all of those connectors that I mentioned earlier for, pick your operating system on IBM Power to talk to the database. And you also have this community around Watson that has developed these SDKs, these really easy to use libraries to integrate with those IBM Watson APIs. Right? So again, the way is open source. Right? Now we talked about it a little bit already when it comes to cost efficiency with the Q&A that was, or the question that was asked earlier on. But I am going to explicitly address it briefly. But sometimes people turn to open source because they say, "Hey, open source is free," right? And you may have even heard the abbreviation FOSS, right? FOSS, free open source software. And when we say free open source, we mean free as in puppies, right? Is a common expression. It's free as in puppies, meaning it's not free from a cost perspective, right? When we say that free open source software, the free is really referring to freedom, not free as in it's zero cost to you, right? And in fact, I even go so far to say if you are turning to open source because you think open source is free, you're doing it wrong, right? You turn to open source because open source is bringing the business innovations that are powering tomorrow's company. You don't turn to open source just because you think it's free, right? It is, however, cost effective, right? But you do have different costs, and some of those we already talked about a little earlier today, right? And what I mean by some of this, I say still needs some glue, right? So sometimes open source is like Legos. And if you were to compare it with other approaches, you have all of the building blocks you need. You just need to piece them together, which is again ties right into the question that was asked earlier about how do you choose which offerings, right? Because you have all of these different building blocks. Which ones do you use to make your little toy car, right? That's the challenge sometimes, and that's why that is a cost. You have to properly assess which of these solutions, which of these Lego blocks you're going to put together to build your ultimate solution, right? And like I said earlier, you probably want to experiment with different building blocks. And again, that's a cost as well, right? Depending on the size of your company and what you're doing, you might also have a little bit of overhead with reviewing open source licenses to make sure that you're not violating the terms of an open source license if you include it in a proprietary service or product offering or something like that. Generally speaking, this isn't a concern, but it's something that you should still have a bit of diligence on reviewing. Review the open source licenses of the projects you're using, make sure that you're complying. And so there's a cost to that, right? Again, shouldn't be a strategic concern historically, that's not a problem, right? The big one is currency, right? Again, we've seen IBM Power clients who've deployed open source and they update it once every 4 years. We've had people not update their whole open source stack in 6, 7 years or longer, right? And again, that's not how you should be managing it. You do need a more frequent update cadence. Like I mentioned earlier, I think monthly or once every 2 months is a really good cadence for analyzing what updates you may need to apply. Right. And then there's support as well. I'll talk about support in a few minutes, but you can get support for open source. You should have support for open source. And so there's obviously a cost to that. But you know, you say, gee, there's all these hidden costs of open source. So how is it cost effective? Well, one of the ways it's cost effective, and one of the biggest ways, is related to time to market, right? Because there's all of these open source packages that deliver all of this technology, and all you need to do is assemble these Legos. You don't have to build the Legos. You don't have to 3D print each individual Lego and then assemble them or something like that. You just have to figure out how to piece together the pieces. And so your time to market can go from, you know, months to days in some cases, right? I was giving a presentation once at a conference, and somebody stood up and they said, hey, can we share a story? And we said, yeah, sure. And this gentleman said, yeah, you know, they were doing some stuff. They needed to integrate with Amazon. And I think it was the Amazon e-commerce interfaces because they had a marketplace and things like that. And they were building this solution to interact with Amazon. And they were using Amazon REST APIs. And they had a team of 4 people that were trying to build it all themselves. And they were working on that project for something like 4 or 5 months. And they were about halfway done, right? And they said, well, let's try open source. And so they had a team of 2 people install Node.js on IBM Power and try to accomplish the same task. And within like 3 or 4 days, they were done, right? So that's where you really get cost effectiveness of open source, because you can have solutions that are done much more quickly. And depending on what industry you're in, faster time to market has implications on revenue as well, because you can have faster offerings in the marketplace and you beat out your competitors and you get more customers, right? And so that's the real cost effectiveness, but it's driven by this large amount of technology that's available in the community. If you're using Python, there's a Python package index, as we call it, a repository with over 300,000 Python applications that you can use to build your solution. And if you're using Node.js, which is probably the fastest growing ecosystem right now and has been for the past several years, we're at over 1.7 million packages available for Node.js. And so again, what you need to do, there's probably a package where you can just pull that into your project, write a couple lines of code to call some library APIs, and you're done or really close to it, right? So all of this talk about open source, what's available, and I'm going to move really quickly here for the sake of time, because you know, I'll drop some links. But IBM has delivered for IBM Power across operating systems. We've delivered these language runtimes, these tools to help make the development process normal, frameworks to make building of APIs and integrating things a lot easier, right? IBM I and AIX, we've done this the last few years by embracing Red Hat technology and actually delivering open source with RPMs, which just the Red Hat way of building and distributing open source. And that has its own set of advantages. It's allowed us to deliver a lot more innovation, a lot more technology. So I have some links here for getting started for both IBM I and AIX if you're unfamiliar with that, right? And again, we do have things like Node.js. We are very large players in the Node.js ecosystem, by the way. One of our contributions to Node is that we've developed this very stable release cycle for upgrade and futures planning and so on. We have open source databases that allow you, mostly these are there to allow you to deploy those open source solutions, right? The WordPresses of the world, you can deploy because we have this available. If you're familiar with Ansible, I don't have time to cover the details of Ansible today, but it's an automation platform that exists in both an open source flavor and a Red Hat branded flavor. And we do have modules for IBMI that helps you do all this cool stuff, install products, manage your devices, do reboots, install open source technologies, do all kinds of provisioning work, right? Forgot to update the logo on this one, but we have modules for AIX to do the exact same things, right? And so it's very easy, if once you adopt Ansible, it's very easy to include IBMI or AIX in your Ansible deployment and do
And we
application
have covered
provisioning and things like
Ansible
that.
before. In a previous session, we covered
Oh, fantastic.
Ansible a bit. And actually, I think we need to bring it back and do another session on Ansible as well. But yeah, that's
cool.
kind of a big one.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Again, language runtimes are the big noisemakers, get the most attention. We've had PHP on AIX and IBMI for quite a while. There's free versions available. IBMI also has the premium Zen servers and PHP offerings to check out as well. But the takeaway here is that it's almost an infinite set of technologies that are available to you. Because yes, IBM delivers hundreds of packages in these RPMs, but it doesn't stop there. There's millions of things out in those package repositories for these languages. There's a lot of stuff that you download directly from the Apache Software Foundation or from Eclipse that you can download and run on IBMI, right? You need to deploy Artemis or anything like that. You can just download a lot of stuff direct from the open source communities, and they're going to work on IBM Power. And quite often that's because IBM has invested in making sure those work well on IBM Power. It's just we don't distribute them. So you have a near infinite amount of technology at your grasp, and that's the key takeaway, right? But we talk about ways of integrating, and again, I'll move quickly here as well, but open source is quite often a very practical addition to your technology stack when you're first starting with it, because you have some new business need, right? And you need to accomplish some new thing. And one of the examples that I sometimes use is you need to send SMS text messages. And you might have this 20-year-old application, 30-year-old application that doesn't know anything about text messages, but it does know about customers and maybe which customers are approaching due dates or, has a meeting next week or whatever, right? And so the idea is simply that you augment with some open source. There's third-party services. We like to use Twilio, but there's others as well. We're not endorsing any particular third-party service, but you can use open source to link your existing code with this external thing. And that external thing could be SMS text messaging, it could be AI, it could be quantum, it could be IoT, it could be any of those things, right? And that's the key point here, is that really it's that augmentation again, right? There's a lot of ways to do this integration. You can simply call an open source program from your legacy program to have it do some work. You can flip it around a little bit and have open source code that calls into the operating system, calls into the database. You can have things stood up and talking with each other across REST APIs or using an enterprise messaging bus or something like that. So we got a question in the chat from Stan. He says, on AIX, there's the Linux toolbox and Yum or DNF oh, that's not a question. He's just informing people. Thank you, Stan. So yeah, on AIX, there's the Linux toolbox, and you can use Yum or DNF to manage and install upgrades. Because yeah, we have on IBMI and AIX a lot of stuff that we are available. And there's just, again, tons of ways that we've built to integrate open source with the core business. Some of this are links that you can take as references after today as well. So one of the favorite things I've talked about lately is Apache Camel, which allows you to, in my words, kind of attach anything to anything, right? You need to have IoT devices attached to Google Sheets. Sure, you can do that, right? You need to have REST APIs and attach that to Apache Kafka. You can do that, right? One of the common use cases we've seen used with Apache Camel is you can actually stream database updates out to some third-party thing. So if you're familiar with Apache Kafka, which is a distributed streaming platform, you can stream real-time data, real-time transactional data from DB2 out to Apache Kafka by using this integration framework. You want to consume data from IoT devices, you can do that as well. Here's an example. It's an IBM system. You can tell from the ugly green on black. This is just a message queue that's getting in light and temperature sensor readings. And if you want to look at the code behind that, this is Apache Camel routes. It's a Java-based integration framework. It's essentially 2 lines where you just say, what are you routing the information from this IoT devices? What are you routing it to? This message queue on IBM, right? And so a couple lines of code, boom, now you're consuming IoT data on an IBM system. And if you want to control IoT devices, you just flip the order and you route messages from IBM. In this case, I can just do a send message to a message queue. You route that to an IoT device. So we have a demo which is much more exciting in non-virtual scenarios. I'd love to be back in person talking to some of you, where we can just do some IBM operation, places something on a message queue or a data queue or database, and this integration framework can route that through ActiveMQ, which we use as our IoT broker. All of that runs on IBM Power as well, and you can turn on a light bulb, right? Or you can control robots with lasers, right? Whatever you want to do with IoT, you can do it really easily with some of these technologies. And you can build stuff so that you can integrate it with SQL and pretty much any language on IBM Power, right? So you can, again, just use this integration framework to tie a lot of things to a lot of things. So for reference, for IBM folks, we do have a nice handful of examples. At least there's 4 or 5 out there out in this repository. So if you're interested in Apache Camel, feel free to go take a look at what those look like. Feel free to shoot me any questions, open issues on that GitHub repository, and we'll help you along there, right? But there's tons of ways to connect remotely even as well. So people are also now augmenting IBM Power with other cloud entities, right? They're deploying applications in OpenShift. They're deploying applications in Docker on their own Docker deployment, maybe using Kubernetes. And so, yes, IBM Power lives in that space as well. And there's a lot of ways that IBM has invested in to make it easier for those applications, those distributed cloud-based hybrid cloud applications, to talk to IBM as well, right? And we also built a lot of ways for you to help expose APIs, because that's a common need, right? There's open source frameworks. You can use Camel for it. I really like a framework called Fastify with Node.js, where you just tie our database connector to a web framework, and in a few lines of code, you can start developing your own REST APIs, right? IBM folks have a number of open source projects that help you deploy APIs as well. Elastic even is more focused on microservices. So there's a lot of resources out there. But I did want to make sure I have time today to talk about support. Where do you go when you need help with this stuff? And again, some of you may be even at the evaluation phase. You don't know where to start. You don't know what technologies to choose. So how do you start? Where do you get help? When you're deploying it in production, how do you know that you have proper support in place, right? Well, one of the resources available to you, I already mentioned, which is with IBM, at least for the IBM folks out there, we do have a repository with a whole bunch of open source examples that show you how to use Python and talk to the database, and show you how to use the Nginx HTTP server and Node.js and all this stuff. We have dashboards out there. We have Excel file integration out there. We have text messaging examples out there. So we have all kinds of stuff just published as examples and reference architectures in some cases to help you. So that's great to help you see how to do things. But what about software maintenance, right? You say, hey, I have software maintenance in place for AIX or IBMI, and there are a couple open source things that those cover, but what's most notably not included is with all this open source stuff, defects and usage or configuration. That's not included in your software maintenance agreement with your operating system. And that's key to know. If you call AIX support and you said, hey, I deployed Node.js and Node.js is doing this weird thing, or it's crashing, or it's not behaving right, your AIX software maintenance is not going to cover that, right? So you need to pursue support. There's a couple ways to pursue support outside of SWAMA. One is community support, and we sometimes say this is free, but it's really not free, of course, because it takes your developers time to go open issues and track down forums and try to usher their problem through a community. So it costs developer time, but there's no real direct monetary cost, right? IBMI has some really active chats out on this platform called River. We also have what we call a general issue tracker, which will help route. You can say I'm having a problem with thing X, and we'll try to route you to the right place to get it resolved. So feel free to come join us on River. AIX also has a really active community forum as well. Their primary presence is out on IBM Community, so I have the link there. You can see just from this screenshot, there's almost 5,000 discussions out there in that forum, which I think started last summer at this new address. So know that there's a community out there to support you, but also if that's not the warm fuzzies that you need and you actually want to be able to call somebody and have official support in place, good news. IBM offers premier open source support. It's available through TSS. It's available for a couple hundred packages now. So we have about, I think there's something like 290 open source packages for which we can offer support. And the valuable thing about this is that it is a cross-platform offering. So if you're running some open source on AIX, you're running some open source on Linux, you're running some open source on Windows, you're running some open source on IBMI, you can actually have a single point of contact to support your whole open source stack across all of those places. And we also, as part of this open source support now, we actually have something called OSPRI, which allows you to sign up and get alerts when security vulnerabilities happen in the open source stack that you're interested in. So that can also complement your security strategy, because you can get an email saying, hey, there's a security vulnerability in ActiveMQ, and here's the vulnerability, and you can kind of analyze whether or not that's actionable for you. So we have a question in the chat. I see, what is the performance impact for using open source solutions? Is there performance data to compare applications using open source versus IBM AIX or IBMI? It's hard to always do like apples to apples comparisons, as they say. Generally speaking, this is going to sound like salesman puffery. Generally speaking, these open source technologies perform very well. Node.js, for instance, there's a story I like to tell with Node.js. Back in 2013, Walmart transitioned all of its mobile shopping to a Node.js cluster. And they did that for preparation for Black Friday. And this is 2013, when people were starting to shop from their phones. And that whole nationwide mobile shopping interface for all of these mobile phones ran on, I think it was something like 15 cores and 26 gig of memory or something, right? Incredibly efficient. So generally they're very efficient. There's also a lot of performance tools for these open source languages. And again, I don't have time to go into details today, but there's a lot of tools to help you do performance tuning and analysis that are, even in my opinion, which is biased, easier to learn than some of the operating system tools for the classic technologies. We have another question in the Q&A as well. Is IBM open source support price per product or just one price for all packages? So right now, the current pricing structure is that it's priced per product per server, right? So if you wanted support for one product on one server, you're paying one price. If you want 10 products across 10 different servers, you're paying a different price for that, right? You're paying a price tag for 100. But the price does go down as you have more, right? So you do get a bulk discount, but the pricing is per product per server. But it is very reasonable. I can't quote prices because I'm not a salesman, but it is. Contact your TSS or your rep or your sellers. You'll find the pricing for this support is really reasonable. Everybody who's contacted their sellers has said, okay, that's a really good price. Significant things that you can get support for. On IBMI in particular, one stuff that we've seen particular interested in, we have people running Tomcat, and you can now get Tomcat official support on IBM again. People running Node, PHP, you can get support for all of those things. Ansible, Apache Camel, which I talked about earlier. Go to this short link, ibm.biz/IBMI OSS support. And you can learn all about this open source offering for IBMI. And if you're an AIX person, don't worry. Most everything in that link applies to AIX as well. That link will show you information about the whole supported product list. It'll link you off to those TSS resources. It also shows you how to open a support ticket if you need to, right? And all of that applies to AIX as well. So ibm.biz/IBMI OSS support, just as on the chart here. I do have just a few minutes left, so I want to talk a little bit about some customer success stories, and I'll probably skip some for the sake of time, make sure we have room for Q&A at the end of today's session. We had a client who wanted to have a chatbot to help with mundane system admin issues where people would get their password or they're having connectivity issues, and they wanted some way of addressing that. And so they wanted a chatbot that was built in Slack so that their employees could just Slack this robot and get resolution for their problem, right? And so they worked with our Client Success Center in Montpelier, and it took them a whole whopping 2 hours because all of this open source stuff was just there and readily available, right? And so in 2 hours, they deployed IBM Watson. They built up Watson conversations around these common use cases. They tested it, and they were able to deploy it in an afternoon, essentially. And so that was a really cool story. And I'm going to put this short link for ibm.biz/IBMI OSS support. Sorry, I have to type as I talk. In the chat for everybody to see if you're interested in checking that out now as well. It's also, of course, in the handout. But they were also able to leverage this cool graphical design tool called Node-RED, which is kind of a low-code Node.js tool, allows you to design the flows of your application. So they're able to just design the flows between Slack and the user and IBM Watson AI, right? And again, all of this freely available open source, so that really helped, right? And I won't go into detail on the architectures for this because we're running out of time. They also had a customer who wanted to integrate with closed circuit television, and they wanted to integrate that with AI. And so they have a closed circuit television camera that they wired up to their IBM power system, and they wired that up to Watson. It was able to do visual recognition of what's in the picture. It was able to record, what was in the picture, who was in the picture, when were they in the picture. So a really cool success story there as well. We have a company who integrated with Amazon Alexa. So their sales team was able to ask common questions of Amazon Alexa. And I think they improved their sales force's efficiency by something like 40%, being able to just talk to Alexa and get quick answers about things. And they did that by deploying Node.js and interfacing with APIs and exposing a few APIs. And again, just piecing together the necessary bits of that puzzle. So I know I'm approaching the end of my time, but I'm going to wrap up with just talking about futures, where are we going, and just reiterate the closing thoughts and summarize for today. So when I talk about the future of open source on AIX and IBMI, the definite focus from an IBM perspective is going to be on integration. Because again, there's a lot of value in that blended approach, that hybrid approach, where you glue open source next to existing applications, right? And so by that, there's also continued investment in those libraries to tie things together, message buses, message queuing technologies, stuff that I've talked about today, cognitive quantum. Um, there's also enhancements that have been going into the database to help with interoperability of oh, thank you for correcting my link in the chat there. There's some really great enhancements in the database to help interoperability with open source as well, right? Every PowerPoint presentation has to have these slides with all these links at the end. For the IBMI folks, there is a brand new landing page out there. So if you go out to ibm.biz/IBMIOSS, you're going to have links to all of this and more. There's blogs, there's videos, there's a bunch of customer case studies, success stories that you're going to get in a single landing page for the IBMI folks. I'm actually working with the AIX folks to try to build a similar thing. So that might be coming in the future. But for AIX folks, the two big places that you're going to want to look is in that IBM community page that I had mentioned earlier, and on this AIX toolbox for Linux applications page, just to see that huge set of what's out there and information on getting started and so on. But I'm going to wrap things up about one of the many studies out there. I mean, open source has been the target of a lot of studies the past couple years. If you've been following the industry articles and the industry trends, Forrester has been doing research on open source technology and where it's going. Gartner's been doing a lot of research on open source. Key players like Red Hat, of course, have been doing a lot of research on open source. And so there's a lot of really cool findings. A lot of them say the same types of things. So one of the more recent ones is the 2021 study by Red Hat, where they surveyed about 1,200 IT leaders. So these are people typically who are, either the IT strategists, the head of IT, in many cases like the CTO or CEO of the company as well. So they enterprise all these IT leaders out there about, what's the state of open source? Where do you see things going? And of course, one of the key findings in that survey, yet another data point to back up the security of open source, is that 80% of those IT leaders see open source as more secure or as secure as proprietary software, right? So if you work for somebody who's a leader in your organization who thinks the opposite, they are in a minority. There's only 13% of people who think that open source isn't as secure. So that is a shrinking number over time as well. People are understanding the secure nature of open source. Another interesting tidbit from that study, 79% of those folks, and again, these are the IT leaders, they expect their use of open source to increase over the next couple years, right? Most of that other 21% said it's going to stay the same, but 79% said it's going to increase in the next 2 years because open source is the future, open source is a strategic initiative. What kind of stuff are they using open source for? Well, again, key things are some of the topic areas I mentioned earlier today. Edge computing, IoT, right? We have a full IoT stack on IBMI and AIX, which is great for us, right? More and more companies have to somehow integrate with edge computing, Internet of Things, and of course now things like hybrid cloud, OpenShift deployments, Azure deployments, things like that. And as you would predict, a growing number of people expect to be leveraging some kind of AI technology in the next couple of years. And again, how do you do these things? You do all of these things with open source. That is the only reasonable way to pursue edge computing, IoT, artificial intelligence, is you use open source to get that job done, right? So to summarize today, open source brings a lot of value to your organization, right? And I moved really quickly today. I know this is a bit of a fire hose, but summarize some of the stuff I talked about. It reduces the overall cost of your projects. It improves the time to market for your projects. And again, that might even have some really great revenue implications or even company reputation implications. It's going to have better security. Going to be able to do a lot more than what your older applications were able to do. And again, you can easily find the skills, hire people in. But another big thing from a strategist perspective is that if you're adopting open source technologies for a lot of these things, you're aligning yourself with the interests of a lot of other large important companies who are also investing a lot in open source as well, because they have skin in the game. So just from that perspective alone, it's very strategic to put yourself on the same team as Google, Facebook, Microsoft, IBM, Samsung, Netflix, PayPal, etc. Right? So that's a lot of the open source value that you get, whether you're IBM I, whether you're AIX, IBM Power, Linux on Power. These are a lot of the advantages, and that is going to actually wrap up my thoughts and presentation today. I'm going to actually open the mic up and hand the proverbial mic over to Joe to wrap things up as well. But any other questions you can put in the chat, or if you can, unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, so I don't think anybody can unmute themselves, Jesse, so why don't we just, we'll take a look at the Q&A. I guess with 400 people on, a little bit less now, but usually kind of a tough problem with that. But there are a couple of questions in the bottom of the Q&A that maybe you could take a look at. I know one of them, you talked about Ansible, and the question is, what about Ansible on AIX OS? And certainly Ansible is available for AIX as well. I think Jesse showed a slide with I, but it's definitely available for AIX as well.
Absolutely. Yep. And then there's another one. It seems to be good to acknowledge that open source is not monolithic and depends quite a bit on what open source software you choose to use, where it comes from, and who supports it, publicly or otherwise. So yeah, you can build Linux yourself, but you'd rather get it from Red Hat or Mongo, etc. Right? And yeah, that's absolutely true, and that's a good point, right? And I don't see an explicit question in there, but you're spot on in the sense that as part of analyzing which open source to deploy and where to get your open source from, you have to kind of figure out, that level of confidence. What are you going to build your business on? And if you're building your business on stuff that IBM is providing and you're getting support from IBM, obviously as an IBMer, I'm biased, but I say that's a really great high confidence way to deploy open source. And so, yeah, you can get it from...
There's one a couple above that as well.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Oh, many open source software are optimized for Intel, but not on Power. This is primarily due to large user base. There are a specific set of open source software that IBM tests for performance and optimize. Yes, fantastic question. Thank you. So we do have some pretty continual efforts into some of the key open source technologies, and we do benchmarking and performance work on those open source technologies. Primarily, those are things like Java. Java already has enhancements in it for Power 10, for instance. Things like the other big one right now is like Node.js, right? We actually have a lot of, we have millions of dollars invested in optimizing Node.js for Power, right? And so we do performance work, we do benchmarking. We don't have public benchmarks that I can share and discuss and all of that, but primarily those technologies that have JIT compilers. So Node.js does machine compilation, Java does machine compilation. We're continually investing in those to leverage the latest instructions that the Power architecture has to offer, and to make sure that the performance is competitive or better than other platforms. So short answer is yes. I think I got that open source support one. A lot of these I answered verbally, but I didn't yet type a question. So
yeah, so all the I think
we're good.
Pretty much did verbally.
Oh, we got another question down in the chat I do see as well, about Power Care points.
Yeah,
to help a resource.
I answered that.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Yep, and the short answer is yes, you can.
Yeah, pretty sure about that.
Yep, absolutely.
That's really a lab services kind of thing, but I'm pretty sure that can be done. And if you need help with power care and you don't know who to turn to, you guys can send me an email, and I can certainly help you with that.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm not
So
seeing
I think
any.
that's pretty good. I don't see any other questions.
Oh, one more popped up. Sorry, I forgot a couple popped up.
Yeah.
IBM/Red Hat changing CentOS to Stream. Ah, damaging to the community/reputation and causing us to migrate away from it and the cost involved. Sadly, not always open source friendly. So there's a lot of different opinions and perspectives on the whole move with CentOS to Stream. And I know we're approaching the bottom of the hour, so I'll try to keep it short. I'd love to talk to you individually, by the way, about your experiences and why you're moving away. But one of the advantages of the CentOS to Streams move is that it allows more enterprises to adopt the latest and greatest updates to the open source stack that's in CentOS. And I realize there's some disadvantages as well, but it is something that we talked closely with our folks over at OpenLogic by Perforce. We have a strong collaboration with them. And yeah, I mean, CentOS Stream is really designed to help customers be more cutting edge and be in position that a little bit more complementary to the traditional like Red Hat stack offerings, if that makes sense, right? And then there's a question: is there a list of open source software supported by TSS today? Yeah. So another question: need the stability. So I'm curious where you migrated to, if you went to like Rocky or wherever else. And again, feel free to email me offline or contact me on Twitter. I'd love to have that conversation. So about the list of open source software supported by TSS today. Yes, if you go to that OSS support short link, it's going to take you a few clicks, but when you get to, actually, I will just put that link in the chat just to save you those clicks. Oops, Control V. There we go. Right in the chat, I put the link. You can get there from a few clicks from that open source support short link that I gave you earlier. But we do publish a whole list of what software is supported by TSS. And it does vary a little by geography. Generally, US and Europe is the most complete lists. There's a little bit of variance for like East Asia and things like that, just based on what skills we have in the local geo, and we're always building those up. So save you a couple clicks there. And what is your favorite open source technology right now? One you keep going back to even. Well, so let me tell you, I've worked on open source for a lot of years, and honestly, right now, the most exciting technology that I've worked on in my whole career has been the Node.js runtime. The technology behind Node.js is fantastic. The way it scales without much effort is amazing. The way that it's governed is really forward thinking as well. We have a technical steering committee. IBM and Red Hat are on that steering committee. A good friend of mine is the chair of the Node.js technical steering committee. But the way that it's governed, the way that they have pre-published stable releases, from a business perspective is really valuable. It's something that if I were building a business from scratch, I'd feel completely confident building it on. But then again, the technology is just really cool, right? Because what they did is they essentially are JIT compiling, compiling JavaScript to machine code, making it snappy, making it fast, and rethinking the whole scaling model when it comes to programming, with everything being event-based. Again, don't want to bore you too much, but like everything being event-based and being able to handle concurrency very efficiently. Yeah, Node.js is definitely the most exciting technology I've even worked on in my career. And so that, and then also Apache Camel, because once you learn Apache Camel, I've been talking about that a lot lately. There's a lot that you can do with just a couple lines of writing code for this integration framework. So you can tie anything to anything, as I said, but really Node.js is it. So that's an emotional question, but thanks for asking. Short answer is Node. And I think
All
that
right.
brings us to the bottom. So Joe, do you want to wrap us up?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Jesse. That does bring us to the bottom, and I appreciate answering all the questions. And actually, I think just your personal insights are fantastic and very helpful to people. I know it's all personal and it's just based on some of those comments, but I think it's still very helpful because you have a lot of experience, and as you said, years in this space. So thank you so much, Jesse. Thanks everybody for joining us. The September webinar is going to be coming out soon. It's going to be a really exciting one. You'll really want to join it. But I'm going to wait until I have all the invites ready to send that out. But so again, thanks, Jesse, and everybody have a good month, and see you next time.
You bet. Thanks, everybody.